Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. It's been a few days, and Vex has been out this whole time, so I feel like it's finally time for me to give my Vex review, given that I've had a opportunity to play her more than a few times over the weekend. Now, to be fair, and I do think I want to start making this disclaimer during these videos going forward, but Vex is a very complex champion. There's a lot of stuff going on with this champion, a lot of ways to optimize her, and especially this early on, there's still a lot that the community as a whole is figuring out about this champion. One can even think back to this year with Gwen's release, or Akshan's release, and how underpowered those champions seem to be, and then people discovered how they could be played or how they can be abused, and then those champions ended up being regarded as too good. So I do want to make this disclaimer going forward. This is just sort of my first week thoughts on Vex and generally where I think the champion is at following her release. I will try to discuss things in a way that makes it concrete going forward and can talk about things that are not likely to change about Vex and what I think about those, but in terms of state of balance, maybe there are things that I've missed. So definitely, if you guys have been playing a lot of Vex as well, let me know if I am full of crap down in the comment section below and if I totally am misunderstanding what this champion is about. Now, Vex, I think, is a really interesting champion and does a lot of things that I didn't really expect. I did know that Vex was going to be anti-mobility. I didn't expect just how this anti-mobility would manifest itself. I was also expecting Vex to be more of a slower, lower damage, higher utility, maybe slightly durable champion, and she ended up being completely the opposite, and ended up being closer to like a burst mage than anything I expected. So let's go ahead and talk through what I like about the champion and then what I'm not too happy about with the champion. First of which is that Vex does in fact have some powerful interactions into mobile champions, regardless of the lack of a hard anti-mobility spell. Holding on to Doom, which is part of Vex's passive, is similar to Annie holding on to her Pyromania stun. Vex loses out on some ability to shove the wave, but it stops champions like Yasuo or Aurelia from casting their dashes at all, because if they're dashing around to stack their passives or for mobility to just kind of keep themselves safe from skill shots, it means they get punished by Gloom procs, the other half of Vex's passive. But if they're also dashing in order to try and engage on Vex, Vex just presses W and personal spaces them away with the Doom Terrify and then can trade on them afterwards now that they're terrified and running away. So there's a way for Vex to just not press abilities in lane, and then the mobile champion who really wants to be pressing all of their buttons all the time can't afford to do that, because it just means that they can't go offensive, but they can't go defensive, and that deprives mobile champions of a huge part of their power budget. Make no mistake, mobility in Champions Kit is a big percentage of power budget, and it really does a lot to strip them of that power. I also didn't have an opportunity to play it because no one plays Callista, but I would love to see a Vex support into Callista and see how that does, because I do feel like that's a good way to punish that particular pick. And now, speaking of Gloom procs, if you're able to constantly auto-attack champions that are dashing, Gloom does a surprising amount of damage. Vex's auto-attacks don't do that much, but with a Gloom proc on top of that, she's actually dealing a fairly consistent amount of damage that does make it so that dashing champions don't really want to do that. Like, you're just going to take a ton of damage for free, and Vex doesn't have to commit that much. The one disadvantage is Vex may or may not have enough attack speed to actually punish them after every dash, especially one can think of a champion like Aurelia, who's very quick on the draw with her dashes. But even auto-attacking them once or twice as they're dashing around is still a relevant amount of damage, and it's not the kind of auto-attack harass that you're just going to heal off in another couple seconds. It is going to be a fair amount of damage that does mean that you don't actually want to be dashing. And finally, personal space being instant and not being a projectile means that Vex doesn't have to outplay you to land the Terrify. You just get to press W, and then you terrify the champion. Now, there is a disadvantage to this in that you need to have good timing on personal space. Unlike Poppy, where you want to press her W in advance of a dash, or potentially during a dash in order to get the grounded effect and the boop effect, Vex has to have this properly timed. The champion needs to be within the area of effective personal space in order for the Terrify to happen. I know this sounds obvious, but oftentimes, especially since this ability is regarded as more of a riposte type move, where you want to be using it before something happens in order to counter it, you need to be using it as it happens, which means that the window for timing on this is a lot smaller than you may think, and you do need to time it properly, because if the Yasuo is dashing on you and you press W too early, he's not going to get terrified, he's just going to continue the dash. Or something like a Zac slingshotting on top of you. If you press it too early, you're not going to interrupt the dash, you're just going to waste a cooldown, and then Zac's going to collide in with you and you're going to die from there. The other thing that I really like about Vex is that she does have a surprising amount of burst. Like, she hilariously feels more like a mid lane burst mage than just like this sort of simple anti-mobility counter pick champion. Like, Gloom procs do absolutely huge amounts of damage, and Shadow Surge does a surprising amount of burst for an instantaneous spell, which does mean that Vex can kind of hit you with a Shadow Surge, and then teleport on top of you, get the Terrify, combo with the rest of her abilities, and you just kind of die. Like, that's the crazy thing about how Vex works. Especially because Gloom being applied to targets it hits, Gloom already does an absolute ton of damage, and because Looming Shadow applies it, and it goes off a lot faster if it's being cast directly next to Vex, it means that Vex can do something like RRWEQ, which just absolutely deletes squishies. And then it does mean that Vex can sort of play as this resetting combat burst mage, which gives her some flexibility. Vex already has the utility of either initiating on her own terms or initiating as a follow-up initiation for the rest of her team. A tank's already gone in, Vex then Rs to somebody, dashes in, and terrifies multiple members. But also she now has the threat of going to the backline, because especially with R's range being measured in literal screens, the range on this ability is huge, you guys. Vex has the ability to sort of lurk and pounce. She does have the ability to follow up on a tank's initiation if that looks like it's going to be preferable, but she also has the option of going for a long-range R snipe onto a backliner, teleporting to them, bursting them down, and then using the reset on R in order to either continue the play, chasing down other squishies, or to teleport to a frontliner in a bid to maybe get herself back to safety. And all of this combined means that R, I was initially skeptical about, because I really considered this to be more of a tool in Vex's toolkit. I didn't think it felt like an ultimate tier ability, but it really has ended up being that because the damage it deals, the range it has, and the reset potential in conjunction with some of the things that Vex can actually do. So I've actually been sort of come around on that ability entirely. And finally, Vex's wave clear is a lot better than I expected. I really thought this champion would have some pretty weak wave clear, but as it turns out, it's decent. If you're able to E a clumped up minion wave before Mistral bolting it, you could proc Gloom on all of the minions and really help you clear them out. And it also lets you help reset your passive as well, since every time you proc Gloom, you reduce Doom's cooldown. So if you do use a Looming Shadow that procs your Doom, you can then auto attack or otherwise damage all of the minions that have Gloom applied to them in order to help get that Doom cooldown back. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the things I don't like, though, as there's a lot that I think is good about Vex, but there are some things that I think sort of miss the mark. And this isn't necessarily something that missed the mark. I did talk about how soft counters are better than hard counters overall for the game, but Vex is not an auto-win into mobility. I know a lot of people had very high hopes that Vex was just going to completely ruin mobile champions' days. If you pick Vex, there's nothing a Yasuo or Aurelia or Zed or anybody can do into you, and that is frankly not the case. Melee dashers can close the gap on Vex and deal significant damage to her, and because she isn't that durable and can die in super short order, which means that if you're fishing for long-range poke or just casting your spells off cooldown, you won't have Doom available, and even proccing Gloom a couple of times won't get it off cooldown fast enough to help you in the middle of an all-in, which means that if you fished for a Mistral Bolt and accidentally consumed your Doom proc, Yasuo is now totally free to just dash on top of you and do a ton of damage. Because, yeah, Gloom will do some damage to him, but it's not going to be enough. It won't trade back as well as you might expect. Yasuo will still outdamage you at that point. I use Yasuo a lot for this, but just fill in your least favorite mobile champion here, because it is like this for all of the sort of mobile melees that want to get into Vex's space. And personal space, like I talked about before, it's a decent ability to help her survive, but it's also not a guaranteed counter, so there is a degree of skill that needs to be had in this matchup, right? Vex needs to be very cognizant of what cooldowns she's using when, Vex needs to know when she has Doom available, and Vex needs to be able to time her W and her other tools appropriately. This is not the kind of champion where you can just kind of walk in a lane and say, oh, I'm Vex, I can't be beat by a mobile champion. You actually do need a fair amount of game sense and a fair amount of playing it very calm and calculated. Again, if you're throwing out skill shots at the regular, you are not going to have a good time on this champion into a mobile matchup. And Vex's mage matchups go about as well as you'd expect. I think that they're a little bit better than I initially expected. Vex does have some kill potential thanks to Shadow Surge and generally good damage into squishies, but her wave clear is a little awkward, and her limited range makes her vulnerable to being poked out. W is just straight up a defensive tool in a mid lane mage matchup, and the shield isn't that good because there is a damage component to it, so Vex sort of loses out on the ability to trade meaningfully with mages, given that both of her long-range abilities are fairly telegraphed. He has a long wind-up period of time where it grows in size, and Mistral Bolt, because it's slow when it starts coming out, enemy champions have plenty of time to see it coming and then to avoid it. So Vex lacks the ability to trade with enemy champions in the same vein that a Victor Deathray or even something like a Rise EQing the wave can be a lot more effective at getting damage in. Vex doesn't really have that opportunity. Again, she has some kill potential thanks to Shadow Surge, but she doesn't have the ability to sort of poke them as they poke her, which leaves her in a bit of an awkward spot. And part of the problem as well is Vex's build paths are slightly suboptimal, I would say. Vex is the kind of champion that needs to be in the thick of things in order to get the majority of her value. Her W and her R are both abilities that require her to be in melee range of champions in order to have an effect. And if Vex is in melee range of champions, she doesn't have survivability. So Vex is sort of incentivized to build things like Zhonya's Hourglass or Demonic Embrace to give her that sort of durability to maybe help keep her alive through these sorts of risky plays. But if she's building like that, she doesn't have that much damage, really, and she becomes more of a utility champion. Vex really strongly benefits from the sort of traditional mage itemization, I would say. Stuff like Death Cap into Void Staff is very much so in Vex's wheelhouse, and I would love to see more of that for Vex. But the problem is going that build leaves you very squishy, and all you have left to keep yourself safe is your damage, which may work in some situations, but may not work in others. So in general, it means that the itemization is a little more frustrating for Vex than you might otherwise expect. All of this means that I think Vex's pro play potential is not high, but I think there are definitely possibilities for her to show up as sort of a flex pick or a particular counter pick for a particular matchup. Pros will be better at managing Doom usage and Gloom procs than average players, and they're almost always better at making use of reset champions than the rest of the community. Vex, I feel, has a lot of exploitable weaknesses, but in the right matchup and the right hands, I feel like she could be very strong in pro play. So I'm going to give this a solid wait and see. But I definitely think that the odds of her being in pro play are less rather than more. Overall, though, I think Vex is a super solid champion design. She has a lot of obvious room for mastery and growth, which is more than some other champions have had upon release. And I feel like she occupies a very distinct niche in the game that I think Riot can explore more. We've had some anti-mobility champions released before, or champions get sort of grandfathered in anti-mobility spells, something like Cassiopeia W or Singed E, for example. Or Singed W, I should say. But either way, Vex is, I think, one of the only champions that's been designed with anti-mobility in mind, and in that regard, I think she does have an interesting take on it. So those are my thoughts, though, on Vex. Let me know what you're thinking of her down in the comment section below, what you've been building on her, how you've been playing her. If you've had an opportunity to play Vex into Callista, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.